Welcome back to the program. This is Aebhric O'Kelly. This week, we are joined by Professor Mark Hannaford, who is the CEO and founder of World Extreme Medicine. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
So tell us a bit about yourself and what's keeping you busy.
Well, I guess world events are working to keep me busy. So, as you've mentioned, my name is Mark Hannaford. I'm originally from Devon in England, and I've been brought up on the coast. My family were seafarers, so that sort of peripatetic lifestyle of travel and adventure has been very much part of my DNA. My background is actually non-clinical. My background is in geography, geomorphology, landforms and features. But for the last 40 years, I've been involved with expedition medicine and remote medicine, working in austere environments. And I've had a 4-decade-long career that's involved expeditions and extreme medicine for the last 30 years. I now live in Abu Dhabi it's a long story, but I was invited to come here on a golden visa by the government. My youngest daughter was just heading off to university, and I knew from previous experience with my son and stuff, once they go into university, I wasn't going to see much of them because they're enjoying life too much to come down to our seaside village and beer. So when the invitation came, it was one I sort of gladly accepted. As I mentioned before, I come from a seafaring family, and as a teenager, my father was the rig move coordinator for the Arabian Gulf. So I've been brought up as a teenager in the Middle East. So it was reasonably, familiar territory. So that's kind of where I am now. And what's keeping me busy for the last 4 years, and I know that you've had my co-founder of the WEM Fund, Luca Alfati, on your podcast. We, at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine, felt that we simply couldn't sit still and not sort of help, really. It was like, for us, viewing history being turned back 50, 60 years. And we knew that the medical community in Ukraine would be needing support. Now, we kind of initially thought, what can we do as a very small organization with limited funds? What can we achieve? And then I wasn't so familiar with Ukraine at that point, but we suddenly realized just how vast the country is. And then actually it's beyond the remit or the ability of any single one organization to really sort of render the support that was needed. So once we realized that, we decided we would be extremely focused in what we did, laser focused, and not allow mission creep. And in doing so, then could, fill a gap that we felt wasn't necessarily being addressed, certainly not at that time, by the agencies that we were familiar with. So that's kind of what keeps me busy, is operating teams in Ukraine. I was supposed to be on a partnership organization with a well-known American agency in the Middle East, which is being postponed because of what's going on here. So consequently, what's keeping me busy? I've actually been left with quite a big gap of space in terms of I expected to be extremely busy right now. So as we were talking pre-call, I'm off to Canada tomorrow to go kayaking with orcas on Vancouver Island. So that's the other thing is, now that it kind of falls back to sort of the kids having left home and stuff, I've now got the time to go back to doing what I did before the kids arrived and going back into doing expeditions and sort of, fulfilling that sort of love of travel and adventure and nature and natural history.
That's amazing. You're going to my old hunting grounds. I was stationed in Seattle with 1st Special Forces Group, and I was on a maritime ops team. So most of the time we're out in Kleppers. They're these folding wooden kayaks from Sweden that can hold like a ton of stuff. And we would set them up and then go kayaking. And you are going like up that strait all the way to Alaska is just beauty, stunning ruggedness. And you're doing the Inside Passage, which is a lot calmer. And you're going to be seeing tons of wildlife, seabirds. You're going to be seeing grizzly bears. You're going to be seeing orcas, because now is the orcas time. Man, you're going to have an amazing experience.
I have to say, I literally cannot wait. So my first major expedition when I was 20 was kayaking down the coast to Patagonia in Chile from a small fishing village. I mean, really small. It's difficult to find even on maps, called Malinka, to a place called San Rafael Glacier, which is obviously a glacier sort of coming off the Patagonian ice sheet. So we spent a month essentially in open Chilean fishing boats with a local fisherman as a guide. We had an expectation that we were going to use the sail for some of it, but actually, I think we used the sail for one day of the month. The wind really wasn't in our favor, so we rode the entire way. And there's a little bit of trying to recreate the wonder that I felt doing that first trip, some of that. And then for many years, I worked on expedition ships. So I've done 4 seasons down in Antarctica during the summer, up in the Arctic. In fact, I was on expedition vessels for about sort of 20 years or so, working with companies, Lindblad National Geographic and a UK company called Nova Caledonia. So doing lots and lots of wildlife searching and watching from these expedition ships, which has included Kamchatka and going through Indonesia, going through around the coast of South Africa, and actually some of the best driving and the best wildlife watching. And I did, I think, about 8 summer seasons was working around the British Isles. When you have calm weather, when you have the ability to go out on deck or into the small boats and stuff, and the water is clear, you suddenly start to realize how much cetacean, whales and dolphins there are. Ordinarily, they're not so clear because the sea's rough, so you don't see the sign of them. But some of the bird life and some of the cetacean and the natural history of going around the British Isles was and Ireland. In fact, one of my favourite places in the world is the islands off. Now, I'm suddenly going to forget the names of the islands where Star Wars was filmed. The closing scene. Can you remember the islands, Eric?
Is that in Ireland? So
Skellig.
Skellig Michael. That's right off where I used to live.
Yeah, that's one of my most favorite places on earth. It's just absolutely incredible. I've been really fortunate to land there a whole heap of times because obviously, as you know, it's quite exposed out there, and the landing's a little bit tricky, so you need good conditions. But oh my goodness, what an amazing place to be. So I'm, going off Vancouver Island sea kayaking is kind of joining all those disparate strands of what I've done over, starting 40 years ago, rowing down the coast of Patagonia, and that's part of the journey. Actually, it was a last minute decision. A sort of mutual friend had a space on one of his trips, and I kind of thought, why wouldn't I go and do this? It's just, I'm so much looking forward to it.
There's a big difference. I've kayaked off of County Kerry. I live in Carrick-Savine, so I did lots of kayaking, and the seas can get rough out towards Skellig Michael. But where you're going on the inside passage of Canada, it's glass water. It's just amazing. You'll see these bald eagles coming in and fishing 30 meters off your bow. And there's like one tree, I counted 11 bald eagles resting in one tree. It's just magical.
Now, are your bald eagles the same as our, what are they called? White-headed fishing eagles. Are they the same or are they different?
Sounds like it. Yeah, they got white heads. They're huge and they fish.
Because I remember I did a trip about 8 years ago through the Lofoten Islands off Norway, which sound very similar, glassy water, lots of sort of fishing eagles around. And in fact, we were fishing off the kayaks for dinner, and the water was so clear that we were putting our lines into the water. They were going down, and then you would see the cod or whatever we were bass coming onto the lines. It was so crystal clear. So I'm kind of, I have to say, I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, very happy that you're having that experience. So I wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. You created WEM, and I'm certain that many of our listeners have attended your conference. I've attended your conference. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think our listeners would like to know how you came up with this concept. How was WEM started?
Well, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell the origin story, because I don't get the opportunity that much. So as I mentioned, I worked as a professional expedition leader, and I worked for a number of different companies. And I would quite often say, okay, for this trip, I think we need a medic on it because it's quite exposed. The chance of injury is reasonably high, and we're remote. And I would be given a medic, but they would be of extremely variable quality. And I've probably said that's all I need to say. When I established a company called Across the Divide Expeditions, which I must have done about 35, 40 years ago. And we set up with the principle that every single expedition we did would have a doctor on it. And at that time, it was a doctor because people didn't really understand, or certainly our customers didn't understand paramedicine and nursing, how that would relate to remote areas. That's very clearly and I think beneficially changed quite considerably. So initially it was, we had a medic, a professional medic, generally a doctor on all of our trips. Now, that was quite simple when we started off because we had a small number of trips and we could use our friends, people we knew really well. But it soon became, incredibly apparent that actually working in our environment, an expeditionary environment, the medics that we brought along with us, we needed to actually train them. So what we ended up doing is, well, in fact, after a year or two, we got our expedition leaders to train our medical professionals. And then in turn, we got our medical professionals to train our expedition leaders. Because if it's a dark, windy, wet night, and actually you're the medic, having a competent pair of hands to the side just helping you find kit, supporting you, doing whatever you're doing as a medic, is really, really helpful. But also from the expedition leader's perspective, it's really useful to have an awareness of how a medic is thinking and the type of stuff what's going through their mind, and being able to support them to do their job. And also, putting in place the next steps. If that casualty can stay where they are, whether they need to be moved, how far they need to be moved, whether they're just moving down the mountain or across the desert, or whether they're going to the next sort of level of care, or whether you're shipping them back to the UK. So, building a community where that sort of knowledge is being shared between those different parties was incredibly useful and beneficial to our expeditions. We, at the very first, also wanted our medical professionals to be there in a professional capacity. So we paid them, so they were salaried. And that time, I think we were the only company in the world which paid on every single expedition a medical professional to be on them. It seems kind of common sense now, but there is still a big section of the market. And I understand the financial pressures on this, that, they're recruiting doctors, paramedics, nurses for expeditions, but actually, there's no financial recompense from our standpoint, that if an event, expedition, a trip is profit making, then medics should be recompensed professionally for the years of training that they bring to the fore. And then after about a year, we realized actually what we also needed to do was standardize kits so that, when a medic came to an expedition, they knew exactly what they were getting. So they could bring extra stuff that they might want to bring that reflected their personal background, their personal training, but the kits were standard. And they were at sort of doctoral level, if that's the right way of putting it. They were robust enough that you could do most things in the field. Initially, we called ourselves Expedition Medicine because we wanted to reflect the fact that we were operating in really quite remote areas all over the world, from Mozambique to Kazakhstan to China, Mongolia, to doing dog studying up in the far north, in the Arctic Circle. We then started to appreciate that we were attracting quite a lot of Americans from America, self-explanatory. So we renamed ourselves Expedition and Wilderness Medicine. We deliberately didn't trademark any of those names because we wanted this community to grow and to change and to evolve. And we wanted to break down silos rather than create silos. One of the things I was aware of when I first started were the number of silos that they were quite protective. And actually they siloed knowledge, they siloed experience, and they siloed opportunities. And I wanted to not do that. After a while, we realized actually we were beginning to think in the same way at running Expedition and Wilderness Medicine. And, I was determined that we weren't going to fall into that trap. So we were also very appreciative that the people coming on our courses, and a conference didn't exist then, but coming on our courses were from a whole range of medical disciplines, from aerospace to tactical to humanitarian to, literally from all, any medical sort of subdiscipline or discipline you could think of was represented on the courses. Well, I came to the appreciation that we could deliver far more to the medical community and to the people attending our courses, and do more good, if that doesn't sound too passe. But we then reshaped ourselves into what extreme medicine with the concept of breaking down the barriers between sort of expeditionary and mountain medicine, for instance, and paramedicine, opening the doors to and making people aware of the huge range of opportunities that are in front of medical professionals in disaster and humanitarian medicines, in expedition medicine, in working on film sets, going into space. There is literally a whole world of opportunity out there, which not everybody is aware of, and certainly, I think this has changed quite a bit. That paramedics and nurses weren't aware of the amazing opportunities and skill sets they brought to the field as well. So I guess that's in summary. I mean, as you mentioned, the World Extreme Medicine Conference, which I think it's in its 13th year now. It's kind of gone from strength to strength. I mean, I've got a great team now that sort of mold that and shape that, and with the MSc program at Exeter University. So it's been quite a journey, and I think our aim is to work even harder to break down those silos and their barriers, to make the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of experience, and the sharing of opportunities even more, even bigger and better if we can, and deliver more benefit to the community that we work in.
I'm glad you said that. Is people don't realize that medicine half of the remote medic training is only half. They need bushcraft and camp skills and what I've seen that you guys do SUV driving skills. I mean, all these added skills that you bring in with your extreme push. So you're matching extreme and you're matching medicine together.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I mean, if we just look at the sort of the expeditionary environment, if you're doing your job as a medic well, and the expedition is well managed, a lot of what you're doing is really basic primary care type stuff, but it's also providing reassurance to people who might be feeling challenged by the environment they're in. But we all know that actually, in terms of if an accident is to happen, it's more likely to happen around water or in a vehicle than it is perhaps on the expedition activity itself, the trekking bit. That's not to say, of course, it doesn't happen, but those are your big areas of risk. So if you have an appreciation of four-wheel driving and the dangers thereof, or also even looking at vehicles and making a risk assessment whether those vehicles are safe to travel in, that then starts reducing the likelihood of you being needed to work in your professional medical. It's about prevention rather than cure, essentially.
As a paramedic, we love trauma. We're very good at trauma. But most of our casualties in austere medicine are primary care. We need to focus on disease and non-battle injury.
I mean, my experience certainly, and this is taking, obviously, putting our activities in Ukraine to the side. But in terms of our extreme medicine activities, even when that's a humanitarian disaster setting, there's a lot of primary care that goes into that. I think paramedics are really well placed to deliver on that because of their day jobs. I think they've got a really, really good, an amazing skill set to bring to this environment. I'm in a perfect world. And in fact, I suppose this is reflected by some of the larger film sets that we work on that help support our work in Ukraine and other places. Our perfect team is a primary care doctor, a ED doctor, paramedic, and a nurse team. Having that range of skills, because everybody brings something to the party, essentially.
So you mentioned Ukraine. So tell us about your passion, your push, your drive to start World Extreme Medicine Fund and help Ukraine.
Well, I think I've done some similar missions before. So, and I can't remember how long ago this was. This must be about sort of 10 years ago. We did something that I supported. It wasn't my dry batch initiative, but we did the support for something called the People's Convoy, which was delivering a pediatric hospital to Aleppo, where the children's hospital in Aleppo in Syria had been sort of destroyed by bombardment. And we wanted to ship a mobile pediatric sort of hospital set up across the border into Syria. So just pre-Christmas, we drove from London with articulated trucks and delivered that to the border of Syria, where it was then picked up by local partners. And not dissimilarly, during the Myanmar coup, we were approached then because clinicians in Myanmar didn't have an awful lot of experience with blast injuries and gunshot wounds, the type of injuries that sadly were a result of that coup. So we supported the medical community remotely in Myanmar with both English but also Burmese sort of language materials and podcasts and educational things too, for that initial phase of the shock of the coup, I guess. So and as I mentioned, when Ukraine was invaded, we felt that viscerally that we needed to want to go and help. But, one of the things we teach on the World Extreme Medicine Conference is, responses need to be professional. They need to be directed and they need to have relevance. Otherwise, you're turning up and essentially eating into the host country's resources and really not delivering much benefit to the host country. So initially, and I think this took us 3 or 4 days to sort of work through, we kind of expected that, we were parties. So what could we possibly do? And we certainly didn't have any budget and how could we help? So we held off for about a week, 10 days. And I co-founded the WEM Fund with a paramedic called Luca Alfati. What we realized that what we could do in the very short term was deliver. We could use our reputation and our access to the industry to ship trauma supplies to the frontline medical community, and that's initially what we did. We put convoys of supplies together. We drove them in minibuses across Europe, across the Ukrainian border, and then delivered them sometimes to the location where they were going to be used. But we set up a partnership with some Ukrainian now friends who in turn then distributed it across the country. And as the invasion evolved and became much longer term than I think anybody expected, our convoys, our supply drops were able to circumvent sieges. We got trauma supplies where they were really needed. We then got asked to provide training. So we started off doing TCCC training, primarily initially in Kherson, on pretty close to the front line, but with the Dnieper River in between. And we spent a couple of years there doing both TCCC, but also one of the things that's very apparent is, there's a civilian population that live in Kherson who aren't necessarily part of the firefighting community or the hospital setup or the border guards, people who we were being engaged to deliver TCCC to. So we then started running sort of street trauma and stop the bleed programs, which we could deliver to relatively large numbers of people and over a relatively short period. So we could do an intensive morning or an intensive and give, it was quite an amazing experience. We could, deliver these training to grandmas and to bus drivers and people who are out on the street, people whose families were being impacted by the community, and deliver them sort of life-saving skills that they could have in their heads if an incident will go off. We could also deliver them with very basic sort of IFACs, so that in their briefcase, rucksack, handbag, whatever, or in their car, they could have hemostatic dressings and the like, where they could render immediate first aid and life-saving first aid. So that was really quite an amazing experience. And we trained, across the organizational board, really, from border guards and, as I mentioned, the firefighting community, but also delivering training to hospitals, because, as you should appreciate, the trauma room knows how to do this stuff. But other people being called in from pediatrics and orthopedics, they didn't have these skill sets. So we're able to sort of upskill some of their medical staff in the hospitals and stuff to give them a slightly bigger capacity. And this has evolved quite considerably. And I think it's evolved, one, from input from the medical community, the people we're training, but also listening and looking and just being quiet and absorbing. So our sharp end is focused on maxillofacial surgical training delivered by Berger Langdana, who I know you know as well. That delivers real benefit. I mean, the medical community in Ukraine and the surgeons in Ukraine are absolutely, they're doing this day in, day out. They're absolutely incredible. And I think what we can deliver is finesse, top tips. We can deliver, advice from outside. And I think the other thing that we deliver is that they haven't been forgotten, that we're still coming and still training, and still the world has not forgotten what the medical community is going through. And the other bit that we're focused now on And as you know, and as your community will know, I think when I first arrived in Hersham over 4 years ago, let's just say that the front line was 10 kilometers deep, hypothetically. As time has gone on and as drone technologies changed and evolved, with a speed that I don't think anybody would have thought possible, that front line is deepened and deepened and deepened. And, the ability to extract anybody within the golden hour is really a little bit of a dream in Ukraine. Of course, that does happen, but prolonged casualty care is the length of time of which a casualty needs to be cared for. It's increased beyond recognition from 4 years ago. And I think everybody will appreciate why that is. With increasing drone technology, the drones can go further, deeper, faster, they're more effective. So, extractions are very dangerous. The use of vehicles is in most areas sort of impossible. So, casualties are having to be kept for a lot longer. So I sent Anna Casper heads up our sort of one casualty care mission. And at the end of, where are we now? Towards the end of last year, I asked him and Travis Kaufman, who's an American PA, to go to the Dnipro area and deliver a Peace Triple C course. Now, what I wanted them to do is not go with a prescriptive script that they stuck to unerringly, but I wanted them to go with the first day prepared. And then I wanted them to talk to the people they were teaching and ask them what they wanted to learn, these guys are living this every day. What can we from the outside teach them? And the answer is we can teach them quite a bit, but it's more about nuance. It's more about sort of focusing on key skills where they feel they haven't quite got the training on. It's about reviewing their experiences and the people they've saved and the people they've lost and mentoring them through that. And so we continue, and it's one of our key focuses is to deliver PCC, but it is very reflective of the audience, of the people we're delivering to. And it's based entirely on the feedback that the Ukrainian medical community are giving to us and what they need. It's because it is an incredibly dynamic environment it's an incredibly dynamic environment. So being too prescriptive, being too formulaic in what we deliver, we'll miss potentially where the greatest need is if we don't sort of go there with a flexible, agile, and a skill set and experience of faculty we can adapt to the local need.
That's fantastic that you train the civilians in Ukraine. To stop the bleed should be taught to everyone everywhere, but prolonged casualty care should be taught to civilians as well.
It is, and we are very grateful and lucky to have a benefactor that supports our program at the moment. We would like to do a whole lot more. We'd like to do, a whole lot more, but we're limited by resources. And, one of the eternal battles of I sort of appreciate, and as your audience will appreciate, of running something like this is, we do it. For the first 2 years, I covered it out of my own funds, but that when you get to a certain stage, it becomes an impossibility. So we would like to do a whole lot more, but we do need corporate and financial support to do that, because we could certainly do more. And our benefactor is incredibly generous, but they have limits too. But you're absolutely right. And so what we also see as being part of our key mission is disseminating those Ukraine lessons learned. So doing that, we do that through a course in Cumbria that we run at Muncaster Castle, the profits for which go to, or the proceeds for which go to support WEM Fund operations. We also we attended Rigorous Warrior, the NATO medical exercise in Estonia, where again, we're sharing our experiences of what we're learning as a team to the sort of military medicine network. And we do as many podcasts like this, attend as many lectures and conferences as we possibly can, to share what's happening and what we're learning, because the unfortunate reality is that Ukraine's lessons will soon be lessons that we have to learn outside of Ukraine. But also, the changing drone technology means that actually we are going to see this more and more, both in conflict zones, in humanitarian settings, and I think also in civil and domestic life. So, what we're learning needs to be shared, and we do as much as that as we possibly can, and welcome any invitations to talk and present and to share our experiences.
You also helped create the Masters in Extreme Medicine. Tell us how that started.
Well, I think it's a kind of a longitudinal extension of professionalizing expedition medics through the expedition company that I set up across the divide. We, so we, as I mentioned before, I think the first company to universally pay all our medics on all of our expeditions to then provide them with a standardized medical kit, base camp kit, and then also to cross train with expedition medics and sort of expedition leaders and stuff. And I think, clearly that provided the foundation, the DNA for the World Extreme Medicine Conference, the WEM conference, which takes place in November in Edinburgh each year. So the relationship with Exeter University was a natural progression of that, in terms of making sure that there's a sense that if you're standing in your greenhouse growing your own tomatoes, you think those tomatoes, I haven't got a greenhouse, I don't grow tomatoes, but I imagine you think those tomatoes are the best in the world. But you need to go outside and verify actually and check actually how are other people making their tomatoes. I know this comparison is slightly fat. How's my neighbor making his tomatoes so sweet and everything else. So it was a healthy progression to move to a more academic setting set up with Exeter, where we could formalize the lessons that we'd learned over sort of 15, 20 years of running expeditions and providing medical care on those expeditions, but also bring in I think our desire to cross-fertilize the principles of pre-hospital care and disaster and humanitarian medicine, provide a foundation and a platform that could be more formalized. But also, it's about, as I said, my passion is to make sure that opportunities and experiences are shared. And, the Masters provides a really good platform for that. My strong desire, and we're seeing this now, is to generate new research, because I felt that actually the research that was being generated, and there were some amazing papers coming out, but they didn't have a home, if that doesn't sound too grandiose. But I wanted to, well, actually, the other thing is research tended to be focused in certain areas. Altitude medicine was very, very closely sort of had lots of resources allocated to it. But there were other areas which were equal, to my mind, of equal utility that didn't have a spotlight pointed at them. And I wanted to create a community where that might happen, where we get these exceptional sort of MSc students looking at the sort of less, I was going to say less attractive, that's not the right word, but less popular subjects in our medical world that perhaps are sort of picked up by the media. And the media love big mountains, they love stuff they can understand. But there were so many other areas where we could do research that would be beneficial, not only to the extreme medicine environment, but we know that what we learn in extreme medicine, comes back to civilian medicine and everyday medicine. It has a positive benefit there. In fact, and as you're probably aware, NASA have been very much part of the World Extreme Medicine Conference since its inception. And I can't remember whether we were on our 13th or 14th years. And I questioned them why they keep on coming to our conference in Edinburgh. And, traditionally our conference is opened by a message from the International Space Station. Their involvement, I wanted to understand the why. And they said, not only does this conference give a great platform for us to share our findings and feed that into the civilian sort of medical community, but also we learn so much by learning from all these amazing humanitarian wilderness disaster special forces medics. What they're doing has direct relevance to what we need to do with our mission with NASA. And that's the point, that what we do in this space doesn't stay in our space. It then gets disseminated and shared to mainstream medicine. We also know from what is it now, 25 years, quarter of a century of working in this environment, that clinicians benefit from these experiences. Everybody, your audience will know this better than I did, but working in a hospital environment or in a sort of trust structure gives, great experience, but also there's some limitations. And by going into these extreme environments, your clinical skills have to improve because you're quite often the only person there. You don't have a barrage of tests that you can fall back on because there's simply no tests. You have to work as a team. You also have to manage yourself much more strongly than perhaps sometimes you do in a more fixed environment. So we know the benefits not only clinically and in research, but also personally. roll back into mainstream medical careers. And, at the end of the day, one of our cornerstone is to make better medics.
For the decades, you've seen countless medics working on expeditions. So, what skills do newly qualified clinicians consistently underestimate when they go on their first expedition?
That's a great question, actually, because if you're an early stage clinician and you want to work in this type of environment, what you're going to do is go and work in this environment. But actually, this can be very exposing for an early stage career medic. And I think but we want people to make this step. So there, there's one of my favorite sort of quotes is from Nelson Mandela, that everything seems impossible until it's done. So I think for early stage clinicians, bearing in mind Mandela's sort of quote is focused really strongly on what the basics, the fundamentals of life-saving skills and primary care. Just make sure you absolutely and get as much experience in a domestic environment as you possibly can, both in a clinical setting, but also maybe by joining a rescue group, a mountain rescue group, Coast Guard, lifeguards, that type of stuff. But also there are companies operating domestically in whatever country you are that are running events that need event medics. Go and get that type of experience because it's foundational and give you the confidence to then deploy into a more extreme environment. But make sure you've got your core skills absolutely nailed and make sure you know where your barriers are. Because when you're by yourself, when you're in the remote area, there's always a temptation to stretch. Know where your barriers are and be happy that at some point you might have to say, no, that's beyond my remit. So I think it's rolling back and sort of summarizing that is get the basics right. Know where your skill set is. Don't let mission creep and desire to help sort of squeeze that. Get local experience where you possibly can, both clinically and in events, and then say yes to opportunities and look for opportunities. And not wanting to blow the sort of WEM conference trumpet too much. And there are other conferences like your own, Aebhric, that give you a community. You're joining a community, so go to conferences and meet people. What you think you're doing, perhaps what you think you're passionate about, when you meet and engage with the community, that might well change and evolve and stuff. And actually you find a much more rewarding pathway for you to take personally.
So your advice for the new medic is the basics. It's interesting how many guests I interview that wind up with that as our final statement, like know the basics well.
Know the basics well, and then prepare for the environment you're going into. This, we call it extreme medicine. I think it's by the name, it makes you sound like you've got to carry a 60-pound pack for 2 weeks across the mountains as high as can be. In reality, there are opportunities for absolutely everybody and everybody's background. So from humanitarian disaster settings to expeditions and stuff. So prepare for the environment you're going into. If you're going to altitude, prepare for that. It's just having your eyes and your ears open and listen more than you talk.
Professor Mark Hannaford, thank you for being a guest, and I really appreciate your influence in this world and the path that you're walking, which is making medics better everywhere.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and thank you very much for the invitation. And, if I can be of any support or assistance to any of your community, then please do reach out.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine. If you would like to earn CPD credits for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credit, free access to our virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on our college website at quorum.edu.mt.